National Museum, United States Navy. I'm David Barker. I'm one of the educators here. I'm going to introduce Nick Guyett. He is a professor at North American University at the University of Cambridge. He is the author of 6 books, including Bind Us Apart, The Hated Cage, which was published April 5th. Today happens to be April 6th. He's written about American history for the New York Times, the New York Review, and books, The Nation, The Guardian, and the London Book Review. He has held many fellowships, including the International Center for Jefferson Studies, and is very excited to come back to the United States for the first time in 3 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Thank you very much to the museum here. It's fantastic to be back in the United States, and it's really great to visit this museum, and I hope if you guys are in DC, you'll make the effort to come here too. On April the 6th, not today, 2022, but April 6, 1815, that's 207 years ago today. 207 years ago, yeah, right now actually, because I'm thinking about what the time is right now in England. It must be, yeah, it's nearly 6:30 in the evening in England. That was the exact moment when British troops began to fire on nearly 5,000 American prisoners of war who were marooned in Dartmoor prison in southwest England. The War of 1812, at that point, had been over for nearly 2 months. Word that Congress had ratified the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, had reached the prisoners in the middle of March 1815. But neither the British government nor the US consul in London would actually let those American prisoners stuck in Dartmoor prison leave until evacuation ships could be arranged. So these 5,000 Americans were prisoners of a war that was over. Now, given that some of them have been in British captivity for years at that point, their ongoing incarceration made them furious, with the British obviously, but also with their own government. On April the 6th, 1815, a minor altercation between those desperate prisoners and the guards led to a tense standoff in the main yard of the prison. The prison governor was a Royal Navy captain, but the guards were militiamen. And they weren't much happier to be in Dartmoor than the Americans they were guarding. Like, they were from other parts of Britain. They didn't necessarily want to volunteer. They'd been dragooned into the militia. So they're the guards, right? During this standoff on April the 6th, 1815, you've got the American prisoners kind of shouting insults at the militia. You've got them tearing open their shirts to show their chests, kind of daring the militia to come after them with their bayonets. And during this kind of really tense moment, the British militia lose their discipline. One militiaman fires, and then there's another shot, and then there's another. The prisoners ran for their blocks, but it was turning in time, and the British turnkeys had already gone round and closed many of the doors that they were trying to get into. They were locked against them. The militia, meanwhile, is chasing these thousands of American prisoners through the prison yards, firing on them indiscriminately. There are even British troops posted on the walls of the prison, firing down from the walls. When it was over, 9 prisoners had been killed. The youngest was 14-year-old Thomas Jackson, an African-American boy from New York. He was shot in the side, and he lay in agony on the stone floor of the prison, just a few yards from the safety of the block he was desperately trying to get into. The Dartmoor Massacre, as it was quickly dubbed by the prisoners, produced a kind of diplomatic flurry, briefly, between Britain and the United States. Officials on both sides realized that this peace deal that they'd recently agreed had the potential to be undone by this massacre, and neither side wanted that. So, very diligently indeed, both sides worked hard to brush this whole affair under the carpet. Those 9 Americans who were killed at Dartmoor prison 207 years ago today were the last Americans ever to die in a war between Britain and the United States. That's a pretty unusual distinction, right? But that unusual distinction meant that they were the final victims of a conflict that would mostly abate over the next 2 centuries. And it meant they were mostly forgotten along with it. So that's kind of the story that I tell in the book. And I try and explain all kinds of things about it. I kind of approach this prison massacre from all sorts of different angles. But today, because we're at the Museum of the Navy, I want to tell you guys a few stories about the Navy and thinking about how my tale, this tragedy at Dartmoor, is connected with the history of the US Navy. And you might imagine that those 5,000 American prisoners of war are going to include a significant number of US Navy personnel. In fact, there were virtually no US Navy prisoners in Dartmoor in April 1815. And among the 6,550 Americans that actually made their way into the prison throughout the War of 1812, barely 200 in total, that's less than 5% of that 6,500, actually came out of the US Navy. So the vast majority of prisoners who were held there, around 70% of the total, were from privateers and from merchant vessels, rather than uniformed US military personnel. And here's a crazy fact. There are actually far more Americans at Dartmoor who've been serving in the British Navy, in the Royal Navy, than folks who'd come out of the US Navy. In fact, nearly 20% of the prisoners at Dartmoor had been on British warships before they were dragged into custody during the war. So, I want to ask today two very simple questions. First one, and again, for those of you who really know your Navy history, you won't need me to tell you this, but for those of you who are curious, this might be interesting. Why were there so few US Navy personnel in Dartmoor Prison? And then the second question, what effect did those really small numbers of US Navy personnel have on the massacre and on its victims? Well, on that first question, it's a pretty simple answer. The reason there were so few US Navy folks in Dartmoor is that America's founders made a conscious decision to limit the size of the Navy and instead to put civilian sailors in the line of fire. And I should say that that decision was not a unanimous one. Let me walk you through a couple of these debates. So this is from the period from pretty much the end of the Revolutionary War through until the War of 1812. The founders, you know, all of the kind of big guys that you'll know about, Adams, Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, they all took a view. They were all debating this question of the Navy. I just want to run you through a couple of quotes from a few of them, just to give you a sense of what that debate looked like. So here we have Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was known as a navalist. In other words, someone who thought a US Navy would be a really good idea. And here he is in one of the Federalist Papers, those essays that were used to try and promote ratification of the Constitution, talking about the Navy. A further resource for influencing the conduct of European nations towards us, in this respect, would arise from the establishment of a federal Navy. There can be no doubt that the continuance of the Union under an efficient government will put it in our power, at a period not very distant, to create a Navy which, if it could not vie with those of the great maritime powers, would at least be of respectable weight if thrown into the scale of either of two contending parties. Now again, those of you who know your naval history will know that the Royal Navy is gigantic. I mean, it's got like more than 100 ships of the line. You know, these are enormous ships that have 600, 700, even 800 men crewing them. No one is suggesting that the US has a navy that large, but Hamilton, along with John Adams, strongly believed that it would be a good idea for the United States to have at least enough of a navy to form a kind of defensive posture if there was a war with France, or if there was a war with Britain, or with any other power. So you can see here Hamilton saying out his story pretty early. I think Washington's idea is a really funny one. I'm calling this the pop-up navy. Here's what Washington said in the draft of the first inaugural. As our people have a natural genius for naval affairs, and as our materials for navigation are ample, if we give due encouragement to the fisheries and the carrying trade, we shall possess such a nursery of seamen, and such skill in maritime operations, as to enable us to create a navy almost in a moment. What a cool idea. We've got all the materials, guys. We can have a pop-up navy whenever we want one. But it'll be wise to anticipate events and to lay a foundation in time. Whenever the circumstances permit, a grand provision of warlike stores, arsenals, and dockyards ought to be made. So what Washington's doing here is kind of straddling the fence a bit, right? So he's saying, actually, we don't necessarily need a big navy right now, but let's at least make sure that we're ready to create one at a moment's notice if we need to, and maybe have some of the infrastructure in place as well. So I want to sort of suggest Washington's kind of sitting on the fence a bit here, not as clearly in favour of a navy as Hamilton, but also recognising that he might need to have some of the stuff in place to get there. Now, Jefferson. Okay. I mean, Jefferson and the Navy is a fascinating subject. Again, those of you who know your onions will already know a lot of this story, but I find him tremendously interesting and important character. And in some ways, for the purpose of today's talk, I'm not saying he's the bad guy, but he's certainly someone who, if he had behaved differently, there's a chance that some of what happened at Dartmoor would not have happened, and I'll get to that in a minute. Here's what Jefferson said in his notes on the state of Virginia. The sea is the field on which we should meet an European enemy. On that element, it's necessary we should possess some power. To aim at such a navy as the greater nations of Europe possess would be a foolish and wicked waste of the energies of our countrymen. I absolutely love this next line. It would be to pull on our own heads that load of military expense which makes the European labourer go supperless to bed. So you're stealing from the mouths of your own people by having a big navy, and moistens his bread with the sweat of his brows. It'll be enough if we enable ourselves to prevent insults from those nations of Europe which are weak on the sea, because circumstances exist which render even the stronger ones weak as to us. So, translation, Jefferson realizes that you might need some kind of navy, but it shouldn't be big, should be really, really small, and every time you spend $1 on the navy, you're effectively taking $1 from the guy who's going to bed supperless, right? What's interesting about Jefferson is that he gets more hard line in his position as time goes on. So that was 1785. Here's 1813, where Jefferson is advising his protege, James Madison, President of the United States. The partisans of England here, so that's the political rivals of Madison, the Federalists, have endeavoured much to goad us into the folly of choosing the ocean instead of the land for the theatre of war. Hang on a second. Didn't you say the sea is the field on which we should meet our European enemy? So he's changing his mind, right? From 1785 to 1813. What he's actually doing is he's even more anti-navy in 1813 than he was earlier. That would be to meet their strength with our own weakness, instead of their weakness with our strength. I hope we'll confine ourselves to the conquest of their possessions. This is the invasion of Canada, the land invasion that the US is going to project in the War of 1812, and defence of our harbours, leaving the war on the ocean to our privateers. These will immediately swarm in every sea and do more injury to British commerce than the regular fleets of all Europe would do. So, this model, where in effect you have a small US Navy, and again, I don't want to kind of besmirch the reputation of the US Navy during the War of 1812. I mean, there is a small Navy. There are 7 or 8 operational ships of some stature. We know the stories surrounding some of them, the USS Constitution, the USS United States. I mean, we tell those stories perhaps a little too often, just in terms of thinking about the relative insignificance of the US Navy during the War of 1812. But I don't want at all to kind of discount that those folks who served in uniform in the Navy during the War of 1812 often surprised the British with their bravery and their skill. But we're talking here about the big structures, guys. When you look at this structurally, the decision has been made by the federal government to keep the Navy very small, and in particular to get ordinary sailors to go off on commercial vessels, to turn them into privateers or letters of marque, or to have these ships that have just got deck guns that are going off to try and do their commerce, to get ordinary, non-uniform personnel effectively to fight the war. They believe the US could succeed in the War of 1812 if it waged asymmetrical warfare. And Jefferson justified this by saying, yeah, you know, privateers men, basically these guys are just in it for the money. So it's kind of fine, right, like if we ask them to risk their lives, because they know it's transactional. You know, I mean, Navy personnel, we really care about them, but these guys, yeah, they're just in it for the cash. I'll just give you one last quote. This is one that Jefferson shares with future President James Monroe, who's then Secretary of State, at the beginning of 1815. This is before these guys know the war is over, so before news of the peace has reached the United States. Privateers will find their own men and money. Let nothing be spared to encourage them. They are the dagger which strikes at the heart of the enemy. Their commerce, frigates and 74s, are a sacrifice we must make, heavy as it is, to the prejudices of a part of our citizens. So just that sentence, frigates and 74s are a sacrifice we must make. He means the public wants us to have a navy, so we're going to have a little bit of a navy. That's a sacrifice to public prejudice. But we don't really want a navy. And here's, he tells you why. They, so this is the relatively small number of US Navy ships, have indeed rendered a great moral service, which has delighted me as much as anyone in the US. But they have had, this is Jefferson dissing the US Navy, guys. They have had no physical effect sensible to the enemy. And now, while we must fortify them in our harbours and keep armies to defend them, so in other words, these warships are now back in our ports, and we're having to commit resources to stop them from being attacked by the British in American ports, our privateers are bearding, like plucking the beard of the British, and blockading the enemy in their own seaports. So, encourage them, privateers, to burn all their prizes, the ships they capture. Let the public pay for them. So make sure the US reimburses the privateersmen and their owners. They, the owners, will cheat us enormously. No matter, they will make British merchants feel and squeal and cry out for peace. I mean, isn't that amazing? Like this kind of vision of privateering. So we don't completely trust these guys, but I mean, our Navy is not going to do anything. Like our Navy is basically kind of for show. So actually we need to rely on the privateers, but they also are going to cheat us. I think it's a really fascinating snapshot of the predicament that ordinary sailors would face. If this is the way that leaders are talking about them. Now, I don't have time to get into this in a lot more detail, but Jefferson's kind of unromantic view here of privateersmen, I think, reflected a broader suspicion at this time among American politicians and American elites more generally towards sailors. Now, we often think of the War of 1812 as being a war for free trade and sailors' rights. After all, one of the major causes of the War of 1812 and all of this kind of tension between Britain and the United States has been the practice of impressment. And I should maybe just say something about impressment. Again, I imagine most people watching this will know this story, but for those of you that don't, across the 18th century, Britain had reserved the right to stop any British merchant vessel anywhere in the world and seize sailors from that merchant vessel and put them in the Royal Navy. Now, it did that to American vessels before the Revolution, and that wasn't controversial. I mean, people didn't like it, but people accepted that's what Britain did to all British ships. But the crazy thing is that after the American Revolution, Britain continued to do this. So Britain carried on seizing now US ships and trying to take American sailors off them. This horrified, obviously, a lot of Americans, and it's very hard for us to get a clear estimate of how many sailors were taken from American ships, but it could be anywhere in the region of 5,000 to 10,000 people from the 1790s to the War of 1812. Now, not all of those were stuck in the Royal Navy across all that time, but we're talking about a considerable number of American sailors who were seized. And you can find out more about these guys if you go off and look at the impressment files at the State Department's archives in College Park in Maryland. There's actually, it's amazing, there's like a mountain of paper there featuring correspondence with the US government from the family members of those sailors who've been seized by Britain, who believed the US could put pressure on the British and perhaps get their loved ones freed from the Royal Navy. But while Jefferson, Madison, and James Monroe, and also other US leaders were really appalled by impressment, I think there was also that wariness that we can see in this Thomas Jefferson quote about the kind of loyalties or the morals of sailors. And there's also a nervousness among American elites about the number of foreigners who are on American ships. And this is a really important point to make. I mean, in a way, when one thinks about US ships, you kind of imagine, well, everyone on them must have been an American, but that's not the way the sea works. It's not the way it works now, but it's not the way that it worked back then. In private correspondence that he had in the early 1800s, James Madison admitted that the number of foreigners, especially British and Irish sailors, on American ships was actually a massive obstacle to solving this problem of impressment. Because, of course, the British are like, well, of course we're stopping your ships. They've got British and Irish sailors on them, and we're just stopping them to get those guys off. But, I mean, as Madison kind of realised, it was also in the nature of maritime life for ships to be crewed by men from different countries. Now, depending on the ship, anything from 10 to 20% of the crew of pretty much any American merchant vessel that you would find during this period would be foreign-born. So anywhere from 10 to 20% of the sailors on American ships were foreign-born. Loose morals, that I want to stand up for the sailor here. And it made them seem, in the eyes of some American officials, I don't want to say expendable, but you know, like a word that's not quite expendable. There's a sense that these guys are not 100% American. And you can see it seeping through a bit in this Jefferson quote I read you a second ago. Now, this suspicion about foreigners in the merchant marine led to Congress passing a bill in March of 1813 that actually banned all foreigners from sailing on American ships. I know that sounds crazy, but that's actually the law that was passed in March of 1813. And actually the law is less important in a way because it was impossible to enforce than the debate. So if you guys have time and you're interested, you can go off and find all this stuff. Just Google the early records of Congress and go off and read this debate from March of 1813. It's kind of crazy. There were so many speeches which demonstrated the prejudices of politicians towards ordinary seamen. And one congressman put it absolutely brilliantly. I love this quote. He said the problem is that sailors on US ships were, quote, Englishmen yesterday, Americans today, Swedes or Danes tomorrow. So you know, like that idea that these sailors are effectively moving between ships and maybe even loyalties. And the supporters of this bill in Congress to ban foreigners from being on US ships insisted the only way you could stop impressment and to clean up the kind of murky worlds of allegiance, you know, amongst sailors, was actually to insist that all American ships be exclusively crewed by Americans. But as I said, the act was totally unenforceable. It's only after the War of 1812 that Congress comes back to this. And again, some of you may know a bit more about this than I do, but I was fascinated by this history throughout the 19th century of trying to have quotas of foreign sailors on American ships. So this problem is not solved in 1813, this perceived problem, and it carries on throughout the 19th century. Now, I should be really clear here that the villain of the story I tell in the book, the principal villain, is Britain. Wary of coming to the United States as a Brit and saying that any of this is your fault, you guys. But I do think that it's worth thinking about the decisions that got made by the President of the United States, by advisors like Jefferson, with regard to how all of this stuff panned out. And the War of 1812 at sea, kind of understanding it, it's really important to understand that the fact there's not a navy is not just about cost cutting. It's not just about trying not to spend any money. There's also a continuing suspicion, I think, about sailors' loyalties and capacities on the part of many American leaders. Jefferson in particular insisted you couldn't be sure of a sailor's affinities, but you could be sure they liked money. And again, back to this transactional arrangement that he's describing in the quote that I showed you a minute ago. Okay, so this brings me to my second question. Why does any of this matter? People often say that about the War of 1812 as a whole, and I mean, one of my hopes in writing the book is I can remind people that this is a really important conflict, and it's one we should spend a lot more time thinking about than we do. A lot of essential American questions get asked, not always answered, in the War of 1812. But my second question, why does this matter? What were the consequences for American sailors of this decision to privatize the war at sea? I think that's not an unfair term. It's kind of privatizing of the war. Well, firstly, and this is a very obvious point, the lack of any major American naval power meant that US commercial ships were a lot more vulnerable to the Royal Navy than they might otherwise have been. And again, in terms of thinking about, like, as Jefferson suggested, sailors like signing up for privateers, or sailors agreeing to go off in the war on a merchant vessel, and these guys didn't have a lot of choice, right? Like, if you wanted to carry on working as a sailor, it was almost impossible during wartime not to put yourself in harm's way. And there was a lot more harm because the United States had a much smaller navy than would have been the case otherwise. So folks who crew privateers like this one here, the Paul Jones, they really did find themselves getting into incredibly dangerous situations, I think, out of necessity. It's ironic, by the way, that Paul Jones was named Paul Jones, right? So after John Paul Jones, a guy who was so desperate to serve in a navy that he had to leave the United States after the American Revolution and go to, like, France and then Russia. I mean, he's literally serving in the Russian Navy because the US Navy is not being built up in the way that he wants. So he gives his name to one of the famous privateers here. But obviously the guys on that privateer are not US Navy sailors. They don't have any of those protections. And let me talk a bit about that for a second. The question of uniformed personnel, the laws of war, what that uniform gives you. Navy, Army, and militia servicemen in the War of 1812 had priority both in prisoner exchanges and also in release order. They tended to receive better treatment from the British. The British tended to see them as being more legitimate combatants, whereas the privateersmen were very often seen as being kind of opportunists or even mercenaries. And again, for those of you who are big War of 1812 buffs, you almost certainly know the story of the USS Argus. There's a wonderful book by Ira Dide, a fantastic Navy vet and historian, which I strongly recommend, about the Argus. Even those guys, who were on a US Navy vessel that was one of the most iconic, kind of feared by the British vessels during the War of 1812. When they got captured in the summer of 1813, those guys were eventually brought to Dartmoor, and they were actually treated relatively well. They were also released far before the end of the war. So they were in Dartmoor, but they were not there for the massacre. They were out long before that. There were also special privileges you got if you were an officer on board a Navy ship. So the entire officer class, rather than being dumped into prison, they would actually be allowed to live in one of these pretty little villages near Dartmoor. So they would actually be allowed to live basically under a kind of house arrest. They could actually move around the town, but at night they would obviously have to come back and stay in the house they were in. This is a really swanky arrangement for a prisoner of war. But get this, that was extended to all officers on US Navy ships. It was not extended to all officers on privateers or merchant vessels. In fact, generally speaking, only the captain and first mate would get that treatment. So you'd actually have all of these officers, all of these people who were in some kind of command position on a privateer, say, that would end up in the prison proper. So the fact, again, that they weren't wearing the uniform meant they were in Dartmoor prison rather than in one of these parole towns, these villages, which were much more friendly places to be. And then, of course, there's the question of remuneration. Well, the US government mostly kept Jefferson's bargain, so it did ensure that privateers got paid for the prizes that they took. Virtually none of the Dartmoor prisoners were offered any compensation for what they endured during the War of 1812. After the massacre, the US government politely declined Britain's offer of compensation, and then the US government was forced to produce its own kind of hasty settlement package, but it was only for those who'd been maimed or killed, the families of those who'd been killed during the massacre. So that compensation offer from the US government didn't go out to the 6,500 Americans in Dartmoor, went out to about 50. So, what, less than 1% of the Americans who've been in prison there? They're the guys who were offered the money. And even among that group, many sailors didn't even find out about this compensation scheme. And in one really terrible case, they didn't find out before that sailor died of injuries he'd received in the prison, which he had never healed, had never cleared up. So the vast majority of sailors who'd spent months or even years in Dartmoor struggled to obtain any kind of compensation, any kind of pension for their services to the US during the war. Now that would have been an automatic entitlement for US Navy personnel, but it was a measure that Congress persistently rejected for not years, but decades after 1815. Incredibly, some of these guys were still petitioning Congress for compensation. So these are privateersmen and regular sailors in the 1860s. They're still approaching Congress in like 1866. This is a memorial to Congress from one group of them based in Marblehead in Massachusetts. So the vast majority of Dartmoor veterans were unable to get on the very meagre pension scheme that the government set up for privateer crews. It was so meagre, actually, that it went bankrupt in the 1830s. And the federal government spent about 7 years before it decided to put a tiny bit more money in it. But these men, the men who petitioned the federal government for some kind of compensation, they also failed in their main target, which is to get the government to give them a bit of land. Again, in recompense for what they had suffered. And meanwhile, in a really vivid example of how the United States had effectively abandoned these privateersmen and ordinary sailors, back at Dartmoor, the unmarked graves of the 270 or so Americans who had died at the prison had actually been uncovered by local wildlife by the 1860s. You could see bones coming out of the ground. And that embarrassed the British government and the American government. And a memorial and a cemetery finally got built. Thanks to the diligent work of the Daughters of 1812, who were founded in 1892, the site's been looked after very well now for more than a century. And if you visit Dartmoor, you can finally see the names of the fallen prisoners, thanks to this memorial, which was erected in 2010. But I think there is no getting around the fact that the US government treated these men very harshly indeed. And the decision to follow Jefferson's line on privatizing the war at sea during the War of 1812 had real and devastating consequences for thousands of American sailors and their families. To that robust naval force, the one that had been advised by Hamilton, by John Adams, and by others. I think it's impossible for us to know for sure, but what I can say is, just as personnel that wear the uniform risk their lives to defend the public, the uniform itself offers protections which are real and which are valuable to the people who wear it. And if the story of Dartmoor has anything to teach us here, the US Navy Museum, I think it's that privatizing war is rarely a good idea. Thank you very much, everyone.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I do have one question. One of the prints that you showed.
Oh, yeah.
I'm wondering, of the prison, is that the one that's at the Naval Academy?
Do you mean this one here?
I don't think so. I think it was the first one that you showed.
Okay, let me go back up.
It was kind of buildings in a circle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so that's, I think, from a museum in Plymouth. That's by a local illustrator. But I'm not sure if you guys have got a copy here. You mean this one here, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You could get a Library of Congress has a printed out too.
Okay, yeah, because Naval Academy has a print. They don't have the original. They have a print of one of these images.
All right.
But in any case.
Yeah, you can see here, what's interesting about the picture is there are 5 big prison blocks. You can see them here. And actually, those 5 prison blocks, each one of them has got no cells, right? So we're in a period before you've got like prison cells, you know, like the kind of modern prison where everyone is individually kind of held. Each one of those blocks is basically just a big floor, well actually 3 floors, completely open, bunch of stanchions down the middle for them sailors to sling their hammocks at night. And within each block, the prison authorities, the British, didn't really care or know very much about what was going on. And there are 5 there, it looks quite spacious. What they actually did, there were so many people in Dartmoor, that in 1811 they built 2 additional prison blocks, so it became really, really cramped. So around that one in the middle there that's closest to us, they built 2 more in the space next to it. And then the prison became somewhere you could hold more than 10,000 people. So it was incredibly cramped. And of course for the Americans, for the first year or so of being there, they had to put up with the French. I mean, if you thought dealing with the British was bad, wait till you deal with the French. I mean, I get into this in the book. I mean, there are some really, really, what should we say, interesting French prisoners. And the Americans had to learn to live with them, right? Because they're stuck with them in a prison, so.
But I'm surprised that the way this is laid out is very similar to modern day prisons in the sense that of this circular concept and with another layer of, I guess, guardsmanship around that, and then a fence. So it was looks like it was probably very difficult to escape this prison.
Yeah, I mean, again, one of the things that really interested me in writing the book is that actually, you know, we think today of the modern prison as being like quite an old establishment. It's actually being set up at precisely this moment. So this is the moment, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, where previously prisons have been places you hold on to people temporarily until you decide what to do with them. So, you know, people have their hand cut off, or they get hanged, or they get sent to Australia, maybe worst of the 3. Those are basically the punishments, right? And actually, prison is just the place you put people until you get the punishment right. But what's happening during this period is for the first time, you get theorists like Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia here in the US, and then also famously a guy called John Howard in Britain, who are saying, no, prisons can actually do the work of reforming criminals. So rather than us finding other ways to punish criminals, being cooped up, being incarcerated in a penitentiary is something that can change people's lives. So this circular prison design, yeah, there are a whole bunch of different people who are building them in this way. Most famously, the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham. You guys might have heard of his crazy prison called the Panopticon. The idea was there'd be a circular prison with like glass walls, and you'd be able to see every prisoner from one central observation tower. And the funny thing is that Bentham actually did have a sort of hand in the building of Dartmoor, or rather he knew the architect pretty well. But of course you can see here that the central observation tower is gone. That actually became the market yard of the prison. So it wasn't a panopticon, but in the book I talk a lot about how this really crazy story of the rise of the modern prison, and this really crazy story about why they built this gigantic stone prison for prisoners of war, how those two things kind of collide and come together in the weirdest way. So it's a mad story. It's really fascinating.
What are the structures on the outside of the longer buildings?
Oh, just here? So these are drying areas. So places where you would dry hammocks or dry blankets or other things. There's also water courses running through the prison. I mean, all of this land belongs to the Prince of Wales. Again, I won't get into it now, but the other part about this, if you're a fan of sort of minor corruption of the British royal family, and who wouldn't be? This is a really wonderful moment in history, because the whole reason this prison gets built is that a local kind of eccentric impresario, who happens to be a friend of the Prince of Wales, is able to persuade the Prince of Wales to give this land out of Peppercorn Wren to the Royal Navy, to the Transport Board of the British government, to build a prison. So if it weren't for the Prince of Wales, this wouldn't exist. And actually the little village built next to the prison is called Princetown. It has a pub even now called the Plume of Feathers, again on the insignia of the Prince of Wales. No, I'm serious. So, like I said, it's a mad, mad, mad story. I mean, just gave you guys today a tiny, tiny sliver. In fact, stuff that I didn't really talk about as much in the book as I'd like to. So.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh my God, thank you so much, guys. That was awesome.